Mr. President, as I think everyone knows, the President of the United States, President Obama, and the Republican leadership have reached an agreement on a very significant tax bill. In my view, the agreement that they reached is a bad deal for the American people. I think we can do better. And I am here today to take a strong stand against this bill. And I intend to tell my colleagues and the nation exactly why I am in opposition to this bill. You can call what I'm doing today whatever you want. You can call it a filibuster. You can call it a very long speech. I'm not here to set any great records or to make a spectacle. I am simply here today to take as long as I can to explain to the American people the fact that we have got to do a lot better than this agreement provides. Now let me just enumerate some of the reasons that I am opposed to this agreement. First, as everybody knows, this nation has a record-breaking $13.8 trillion national debt at the same time as the middle class is collapsing and poverty is increasing. And Mr. President, I think it's important that we say a word, because I'm not sure that a lot of Americans necessarily know this, about how we got to where we are today in terms of the national debt. I know there are some people who think that this all began the day that President Obama took office. Well, it's not quite the case. When President Clinton left office, this country was running, in fact, a very significant surplus, and the projections were that we were going to continue to run a surplus. During the 8 years of President Bush, for a number of reasons, including the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, including huge tax breaks for the wealthiest people in this country, including a Medicare Part D prescription drug program, and including the Wall Street bailout, among other things, all of which were not paid for. Those are the primary reasons that we saw an almost doubling of the national debt during the Bush administration. And since President Obama has been in office, we have passed a stimulus package, also adding to the deficit in national debt. But here we are today with a $13.8 trillion national debt, $1.4 trillion deficit, and almost all Americans are in agreement that this is a very serious issue. So the first point that I would make is that it seems to me to be unconscionable for my conservative friends and for everybody else in this country to be driving up this already too high national debt by giving tax breaks to millionaires and billionaires who don't need it, and in a number of cases, Mr. President, don't even want it. Here's one of the interesting ironies. There are lists of many, many very wealthy people who've come forward and say, sure, I want a tax break. Everybody wants a tax break. But you know what? There are other priorities in this country. I don't need it. And two of the wealthiest people in the world, Bill Gates of Microsoft, Warren Buffett, Berkshire, these are billionaires, and they said it's absurd. We don't need a tax break. And all over the country, you're hearing a lot of folks who have a lot of money saying, don't drive up the deficit and force our kids to pay higher taxes to pay off the national debt in order to give tax breaks to the richest people in this country. Now, Mr. President, we have been told really not to worry too much because the extension of these tax breaks for the wealthy will only last 2 years. Not to worry. Well, maybe that's the case. But given the political reality that I have seen in Washington, my guess is that 2 years from now, these tax breaks for the wealthiest people in this country will be extended again. What happens around here is that the argument will be made that if you end these tax breaks, you're raising taxes. It's what we're hearing right now. I see no reason why in the middle of a presidential election those arguments will not be made again, and I see no reason not to believe that those tax breaks will be extended again. And clearly we have a number of Republicans who want to make that extension permanent. Now, whether it will ever be made permanent or not, I don't know. But the point is, when you hear folks say that it's only a 2-year extension, I would suggest take that with a grain of salt. And let me just say that if, in fact, we do what the Republicans have wanted to do right now, as we enter this debate, they wanted a 10-year extension. That would add $700 billion to our national debt, $700 billion. Now, I've got 4 kids, and I've got 6 grandchildren. And I think it is grossly unfair. None of them have a whole lot of money. I think it is grossly unfair to ask my kids and grandchildren and the children all over this country to be paying higher taxes in order to provide tax breaks for billionaires because we've driven up the national debt. That is just plain wrong. And Mr. President, I think the vast majority of the American people, whether they're progressives like myself or whether they're conservatives, I think they perceive that that concept, that giving tax breaks to billionaires when we have such a high national debt, makes no sense at all. Furthermore, Mr. President, it is important to point out that extending income tax breaks to the top 2% is not the only unfair tax proposal in this agreement. This agreement between the President and the Republican leadership also calls for a continuation of the Bush-era 15% tax rate on capital gains and dividends, meaning that those people who make their living off their investments will continue to pay a substantially lower tax rate than firemen, teachers, nurses, carpenters, and virtually all the other working people of this country. And I just don't think that that's fair. That's wrong. And we are continuing, if this agreement were to be passed, that unfair arrangement. Mr. President, on top of all of that, this agreement includes a horrendous proposal regarding the estate tax. And that is a Teddy Roosevelt initiative. Teddy Roosevelt was talking about this in the early years of the 20th century. It was enacted in 1916. And it was enacted for a couple of reasons. Teddy Roosevelt and the people of that era thought it was wrong that a handful of people could have a huge concentration of wealth and then just give that wealth, transmit that wealth to their children. He didn't think that that was right. Furthermore, it was a source, a progressive and fair source of revenue. Under the agreement struck between the Republican leadership and the President, the estate tax rate, which was 55% under President Clinton, and let's all remember, we had problems with the economy under President Clinton, but very few will deny that during those years we were creating a heck of a lot more jobs than we did under President Bush. That's the fact. Over 20 million jobs under President Clinton. We lost 600,000 private sector jobs under President Bush. During the Clinton era, the tax rate on the estate tax was 55%. What this arrangement would do is lower that tax rate to 35% with an exemption on the first $5 million of an individual's estate, $10 million for couples. Now, here's the important point, Mr. President, that I think many people don't know, because I have to confess, my Republican friends and their pollsters and their language people have done a very good job. This is the so-called death tax. And I think all over America, people are saying, oh, this is terrible. I have $50,000 in the bank and I want to leave that to my kids. And the government is going to take 55% of that, 35% of that. What an outrage. So let us be very, very clear. This tax applies only to the top 0.3% of American families. 99.7% of American families will not pay one nickel in an estate tax. This is not a tax on the rich. This is a tax on the very, very, very rich. And if my Republican friends had been successful in doing what they want to do, which is eliminating this estate tax completely, it would have cost, Mr. President, our Treasury, raised the national debt by $1 trillion over a 10-year period. Families like the Walton family of Walmart fame would have received, as one family, about a $30 billion tax break. So I find it hard to believe that when we are talking about massive cuts in programs for working families, when we have this huge national debt, that anybody would be agreeing to lower the estate tax rate to 35%. That is what this agreement does, and I think that that is a very, very bad idea. And once again, while the agreement on the estate tax is for 2 years, once again, there is very little doubt in my mind that the Republicans will continue to push for lower and lower estate tax rates because what they want, and I think Senator Kyle has been pretty clear about this, they want to permanently repeal that tax. That is $1 trillion in tax breaks to the top 0.3%. So I think we're down a bad path there, and that's another reason why this agreement does not make a whole lot of sense. Mr. President, I would say thirdly, and here's a very important point that I think has not yet gotten the attention that it deserves. And that is, this agreement contains a payroll tax holiday, which would cut $120 billion from Social Security payroll taxes for workers. And I think there are a lot of folks out there who say, well, this is pretty good. You know, I'm a worker. My contribution will go from 6.2% today down to 4.2%. I'll have more money in my paycheck. It's a good idea. Let's take a deep breath and let's think about it for a second. Let's understand what this whole thing is about. This payroll tax holiday concept, as I understand it, originally started with conservative Republicans. And I know the Vice President recently made the point this was originally a Republican idea. Now, why did the Republicans come up with this idea? Well, these are exactly the same people who don't believe in Social Security. These are the same people who either want to make significant cuts in Social Security or else they want to privatize Social Security entirely. And here's the point. They understand that if we divert funding that is supposed to go into the Social Security Trust Fund, which is what this payroll tax holiday does. This is money that goes into the Social Security Trust Fund is now being diverted, cut back, in order to provide financial support for workers. But that is a lot of money not going into the trust fund. Now, what the President and others are saying, well, not to worry, because that money will be covered by the general fund. That is a very, very bad and dangerous precedent, because up until now, what Social Security has been about is 100% funding from payroll contributions, not from the general tax base. Now, once again, this is a one-year program. The loss of revenue going into Social Security can be covered by the general fund. But we have a $13 trillion national debt. How much longer will the general fund put money into Social Security? Is it a good idea for the general fund to be doing that? So I would argue, Mr. President, that this is not a good idea. This is a very dangerous step forward for those of us who believe in Social Security. But this is not just Bernie Sanders saying this. Mr. President, one of the more effective and I think important senior groups in America is called the National Committee to Preserve Social Security and Medicare. They have, I don't know exactly how many, but they have many, many members all over this country. I know they're active in the state of Vermont. And I want to read to you from a press release that they just sent out the other day. And this is the headline on it, from the National Committee to Preserve Social Security and Medicare. Cutting contributions to Social Security signals the beginning of the end. Payroll tax holiday is anything but. And this is what they say. This comes from now Barbara Kennelly. Barbara used to serve in the House of Representatives. I've known Barbara for years. She's now the president and CEO of the National Committee to Preserve Social Security, one of the strong senior groups in America. And this is what Barbara says, and I quote, "Even though Social Security contributed nothing to the current economic crisis, it has been bartered in a deal that provides deficit-busting tax cuts for the wealthy. Diverting $120 billion in Social Security contributions for a so-called tax holiday may sound like a good deal for workers now, but it's bad business for the program that a majority of middle-class seniors will rely upon in the future." And that's what the National Committee to Preserve Social Security and Medicare says about that agreement, and I agree with them. So for all of us who understand that Social Security is life and death for tens of millions of Americans today and will be vitally important for working people as they reach retirement age, that we understand that Social Security has done a great job. You know, Mr. President, a few minutes ago you were on the floor talking about the strong work that our federal employees do, and you're absolutely right. Sometimes we also take for granted that Social Security has been an enormous success. It has done exactly what those people who created it wanted it to do. Nothing more, nothing less. It succeeded. It has taken millions and millions of seniors out of poverty, given them an element of security. It has also helped people with disabilities maintain their dignity. Widows and orphans are also getting help. For 75 years, it has worked well. It has a $2.6 trillion surplus today, and it can pay out benefits for the next 29 years. It is strong. We want to make it stronger. This payroll tax holiday, I'm afraid, is a step very much in the wrong direction, and that is one of the important reasons why this agreement between the president and the Republicans should be defeated. Mr. President, included in the agreement are a number of business tax cuts. And I'm not going to be here to say that some of them may not work. Some of them may work. Some of them will work better than others. There are a whole list of them. But this is what I will say. Economists on both ends of the political spectrum believe that if we are serious about addressing the horrendous economic crisis that we're in now, 9.8% unemployment, that there are far more effective ways of creating the jobs that we have to create than those tax proposals. With corporate America already sitting on close to $2 trillion cash on hand. It's not that our friends in corporate America don't have any money. We've got to help them. They've got $2 trillion cash on hand. The problem is not, in my view, that corporate taxes are too high. It is that the middle class simply doesn't have the money to purchase the goods and products that make our economy go and create jobs. So I think that if our goal is to create the millions and millions of jobs that we need, and if our goal is to make our country stronger internationally in a very tough global economy, I would much prefer, and I think most economists would agree with me, that a better way to do that, to create the millions of jobs we've got to create, is to invest heavily in our infrastructure. Now, the truth is, and I don't think anyone disputes this, the infrastructure in the United States is crumbling, and I'll go into more detail about that later. Got some very good information on it. But, you know, you don't have to be a civil engineer to know that. All you have to do is get in your car today and drive someplace. And in my state and all over this country, what you are going to see roads that are in disrepair. You're going to see bridges that in some cases have actually been shut down. You're going to see water systems. I remember, Mr. President, I was in Rutland, Vermont, the second or third largest city in the state of Vermont. And the mayor there showed me a piece of pipe. It's very funny. It's an old pipe. And he said, you know, the engineer who helped develop this water system and laid this pipe, he went off, after he did this work for Rutland, he went off to fight in the war. And he knew I knew there was a catch line coming. I said, well, what war was that? And he said it was the Civil War. So you're talking about water pipe being laid in Rutland, Vermont, and this is true all over the United States, laid in the Civil War. And the result is we lose an enormous amount of clean water every day through leaks, water pipes bursting every day, all over the United States of America. Well, we can put people to work improving our water system, our wastewater plants, very expensive proposition to develop good wastewater plants. I was a mayor, you were a governor. It is an expensive proposition. Roads, bridges. Furthermore, Mr. President, I don't have to tell anybody here, our rail system, which used to be the greatest rail system in the world, is now falling way behind every other major country on earth. In Vermont, as a result of the stimulus package, which did a whole lot of very good things in the state of Vermont, one of the things we're able to do is use $50 million of federal fund, private money, to make major repairs on one of our important railways in the state. But we remain far behind most other countries around the industrialized world. China is exploding in terms of the number of high-speed rail lines that they have. We have got to do better. Our airports need work. Our air controllers need to be updated in terms of the technology they use to make our flights safe. And the point here is that what most economists would tell you is, A, when you invest in infrastructure, you get a bigger bang for the buck, you create more jobs for your investment than in most instances giving a variety of tax breaks to the corporate world. And second of all, and not unimportantly, when you invest in infrastructure, you are improving the future of this country. You're making us more productive. It's not just creating jobs, it's creating jobs for a very specific purpose, which makes our nation more productive and efficient. And thirdly, let me tell you something, as a former mayor, infrastructure does not get better if you ignore it. You know, you could turn your back if you're a mayor or a governor on the roads and on the highways because you don't have the money to fix them today. They ain't going to get better next year. At some point, they're going to have to be repaired and fixed, and we may as well do that right now. So I believe that the money, the very substantial sums of money in this agreement between the president and the Republicans, which goes into tax breaks for corporate America, could be much better spent, more effectively spent on the infrastructure. Point I want to make in opposition to this agreement is that what we have heard from the president and others is that, look, this is a compromise. You can't get everything you want. Well, you can't get everything what you want around here. That's true. But one of the examples of the compromise is an extension of unemployment benefits for 13 months. Well, let me be very, very clear. In the midst of a serious and major recession, at a time when millions of our fellow Americans are not only out of work through no fault of their own, but they have been out of work for a very, very long time. It would be, in my view, immoral and wrong to turn our backs on those workers. Their unemployment benefits are going to be running out soon, and it is absolutely imperative that we extend those unemployment benefits for the 2 million workers who would lose them. But here's the point that I want to make, Mr. President. Some people say that this is a compromise. Well, the Republicans gave on unemployment, the President gave on extending tax breaks for the rich, et cetera, et cetera. But here's the point. I don't believe, honestly, that the Republican support now for extending unemployment benefits really constitutes much of a compromise. Because the truth of the matter is that for the past 40 years, under both Democratic and Republican administrations, under the leadership in the Senate and the House of Democrats or Republicans, it has been bipartisan policy that whenever the unemployment rate has been above 7.2%, unemployment insurance has always been extended. So what you have had is long-standing bipartisan policy. That's what we have always done. That is what we should be doing in the future. I do not regard that Republicans now supporting what their party has always supported, extending unemployment benefits when unemployment becomes very high. I don't see that as a compromise. I see that as what has been going on in this country and in the Senate for 4 decades. Now, Mr. President, I've talked about the negative aspects of this proposal, but I am going to be the first to admit that, of course, there are positive and good agreements in this. And what are they? What are some of the positive aspects of this agreement? Let me just tick them off. Number one, I believe very strongly, and I know the President does, that it is absolutely imperative that we extend middle-class tax cuts for 98% of the American people. I don't think there's been any debate about that. When median family income has gone down by over $2,000 during the Bush years, when millions of our people today are working longer hours for low wages, when people can't afford to send their kids to college or take care of child care, I think it makes absolute sense. I don't think anyone denies that it is absolutely imperative that we extend middle-class tax cuts, and that's what this provision does, and that's the right thing. Furthermore, in this agreement, we have an extension of the Earned Income Tax Credit to working Americans, and the child and college tax credits are also in there. Every one of these agreements is very, very important. These programs will keep millions of Americans from slipping out of the middle class and into poverty, and they will allow millions of Americans to send their kids to college. So I'm not here to say that there is not anything of value in this agreement between the President and the Republicans. They are. And we have got to fight to make sure that all of those programs remain in the final package when it is passed, when the final package is passed. But when we look at the overall agreement, we must put it in a broader context, and that is, what will the passage of this legislation mean for the future of our country? And in that area, if you look at it in that context, I think the evidence is pretty strong that it is just not a good agreement and not something that should be passed. Mr. President, passage of this agreement would mean that we would continue the Bush policy of trickle-down economics for at least 2 more years. And that is not a good thing to do, because I think, as most Americans know, that philosophy, that economic approach, simply did not work. The evidence is quite overwhelming. I don't think there's much debate. When median family income during Bush's 8 years goes down by $2,200, when we end up losing over 600,000 private sector jobs, and all of the job growth was in the federal level, I don't see how anybody would want to continue that philosophy. But that, in essence, is what will happen if this agreement is passed. Now, I want to say make another point here about what happens if, and I will do my best to prevent this from happening, but what would happen if this agreement would pass? Does anybody seriously believe that our Republican colleagues would then say, oh, okay, well, we've got an extension of tax breaks for the very richest people. We've lowered the tax rate on the estate tax. Those are good victories for millionaires and billionaires, and we're going to go home now. We're not going to continue the fight. I don't think so. I don't think so at all. We're already hearing soundings about where our Republican friends want to go. The President put together what I thought was a very poor deficit reduction commission. I thought that the folks on it were not reflective of the American people. I thought there was a very much big business, corporate partiality there. And the initiatives that came out of that commission, which fortunately did not get the 14 votes they needed, suggest to me that those of us who are concerned about protecting the needs of the middle class and working families, we are going to have to be pushing back pretty hard for what's coming down the pike. I think that what we will be seeing is that if this proposal negotiated between the president and the Republicans is passed, what you will be seeing within a few months are folks coming here on the floor of the Senate, and this is what they'll say. They'll say, you know what? Deficit is high, national debt is too high, and yes, oh yes, we drove the national debt up by giving tax breaks to billionaires, but that's the way it goes. But we're going to have to deal with that national debt. And then the Republicans will tell us we have a great way to deal with it. We've given tax breaks to billionaires, but now what we're going to have to do is start making deep cuts in Social Security. And that Deficit Reduction Commission started paving the way for that. Very substantial cuts in Social Security. Maybe we'll have to raise the retirement age in Social Security to 69 or 70. Maybe we'll have to make cuts in Medicare. Maybe we'll have to make cuts in Medicaid. And I think we're beginning to see in the state of Arizona now what goes on when you make deep cuts in Arizona, in Medicaid. In Arizona right now, there are people who are in line who need transplants, who will die if they don't get transplants. And in Arizona, as a result of legislation that they passed there, they're saying to people, young people, sorry, we can't afford to give you the transplant, and you're going to have to die. Well, is that what we're looking forward to seeing all over America? I certainly will do everything I can to prevent that. We're certainly going to see attacks on environmental protection, on education. Some of us believe that if this country is going to prosper, succeed in the global economy, we've got to have the best educational system in the world, from childcare through college. Right now, it is extremely difficult for middle-class families to send their kids to college. Does anyone have any doubt whatsoever that our Republican friends are not going to come back here and say, we can't afford to raise Pell Grants as we have in recent years. We can't afford to support working families who are having their kids in childcare. Cut. That is in fairness to them. They've been pretty honest about it. So I would suggest, Mr. President, that if their argument is that we have a high deficit and a high national debt, that if we pass this agreement and the national debt goes higher, it only gives them more impetus to go forward to cut programs that benefit working families and the middle class. And let me also say that there is no doubt in my mind what many of, not all, but many of my Republican colleagues want to do. And that is they want to move this country back into the 1920s, when essentially we had an economic and political system which was controlled by big money interests, where working people in the middle class had no programs to sustain them when things got bad, when they got old, when they got sick, when labor unions were very hard to come by because of anti-worker legislation. And that's what they want. They don't believe in things like the Environmental Protection Agency. They don't believe in things like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, federal aid to education. And that is the fight that we will be waging. And I think to surrender on this issue is simply to say that we're going to be waging fight after fight starting within a couple of months. Now, Mr. President, President Obama has said that he fought as hard as he could against the Republican tax breaks for the wealthy and for an extension in unemployment. Well, maybe, but the reality is that that fight cannot simply be waged inside the Beltway. What our job is to appeal to the vast majority of the American people to stand up and to say, wait a minute, I don't want to see our national debt explode. I don't want to see my kids and grandchildren paying higher taxes in order to give tax breaks to millionaires and billionaires. The vast majority of the American people do not support that agreement in terms of giving tax breaks to the very rich. And our job is to rally those people. And I would like very much to see the American people saying to our Republican colleagues, some Democratic colleagues, excuse me, don't force my kids to have a lower standard of living in order to give tax breaks to the richest people in this country. And what the president and all of us should be doing is going out and saying to those people, call up the members of the Senate, call up the members of the House and say, excuse me, how about representing the middle class and working families for a change rather than the wealthiest people in this country? That's what democracy is about. This fight is not going to be won inside the Beltway here in a Senate debate. It is going to be won when the American people stand up and say, wait a second, we cannot continue to give tax breaks to people who are doing phenomenally well right now. We can't give tax breaks to the rich when we already have the most unequal distribution of income of any major country on earth. Top 1% earns 23% of all income in America, more than the bottom 50%. They don't need more tax breaks to be paid for by our kids and our grandchildren. In my view, Mr. President, vast majority of people are behind us on this issue, but they have got to make their voices heard to their senators, to their congressmen. And when they do, I believe we can come forward with an agreement which protects the middle class and working families and not is a boondoggle for the wealthiest people in this country. It is important to put the agreement that the president struck with the Republicans in a broader context. You can't just look at an agreement unto itself. You have to look at it within the context of what's going on in this country today, both economically and politically. And in my view, and I think I speak for millions and millions of Americans on this, there is a war going on in this country. And I'm not referring to the war in Iraq or the war in Afghanistan. I'm talking about a war being waged by some of the wealthiest, the most powerful people in this country against the working families of the United States, against the disappearing and shrinking middle class of our country. The billionaires of America are on the warpath. They want more and more and more. And that has everything to do with this agreement reached between the Republicans and the president. Mr. President, in 2007, the top 1% of all income earners in the United States made 23.5% of all income. Let me repeat that. Top 1% earned over 23% of all income. That is more than the bottom 50%. 1% here, 50% here. But for the very, very wealthy in this country, that's apparently not enough. The percentage of income going to the top 1% nearly tripled since the 1970s. Now, all over this country, people are angry, they're frustrated. It's true in Vermont, I'm sure it's true in Virginia, it's true all over America. But one of the reasons that people are angry and frustrated is they're working incredibly hard. In the state of Vermont, which I represent, I can tell you, there are people who don't work one job, they don't work two jobs, there are people who are working 3 jobs and 4 jobs trying to cobble together an income in order to support their families. And I suspect that goes on all across the country. But people are working harder and harder. In many cases, their income is going down. And the fact is that 80% of all new income earned from 1980 to 2005 has gone to the top 1%. Let me repeat that because that's an important fact. And I think that explains why the American people are feeling as angry as they are right now. They're working hard. They're not going anyplace. In some cases, their standard of living, many cases, actually going down. 80% of all income in recent years has gone to the top 1%. Richest people become much richer, middle class shrinks, millions of Americans fall out of the middle class into poverty. But that is not apparently enough. Our friends at the top who have a religious ferocity in terms of greed, they need more and they need more. It's like an addiction. 50 million is not enough. They need 100 million. 100 million is not enough. They need a billion. Billion is not enough. I'm not quite sure how much they need. When will it stop? Today, in terms of wealth as opposed to income, the top 1% now owns more wealth than the bottom 90%. You know, Mr. President, we went to school and we used to read in the textbooks about Latin America, for example, and they used to refer to some of the countries there as what they call banana republics, countries in which a handful of families control the economic and political life of the nation. Well, I don't want to get the American people too upset, but we are not all that far away from that reality today. Top 1% has seen a tripling of the percentage of income they earn since 1970s. Top 1% owning 23% of all income, more than the bottom 50%. Top 1% now owns more wealth than the bottom 90%. That's not the foundation of a democratic society. That's the foundation for an oligarchic society. But, hey, rich get richer, middle class shrinks, poverty increases. Apparently that is not good enough yet for some of the richest people in this country. And I say some of the richest, because there are a lot of folks there who have a lot of money who do love this country, who do want to do the right thing. They're not into greed, but there are some who want more. That's what they need. For example, and this I think galls me and I think galls many of the people in this country, the horrendous recession that we're in right now, where millions and millions of people have lost their jobs, they've lost their savings, they've lost their homes. This recession is caused by the greed and recklessness and illegal behavior. Let me underline it, I'll talk about more of this later. The illegal behavior on Wall Street. So these guys, through their greed, resulted in the most severe economic recession since the Great Depression. The American people bailed them out, and now 2 years after the bailout, guess what? They are giving themselves more compensation than they ever have. So they're saying to the American people, sorry we caused this recession because of our greed. Sorry you're unemployed. Sorry you lost your house. But you know what? That's not really all that important. What's important is that I, on Wall Street, continue to get tens of millions of dollars in compensation and in bonuses, that I have big parties. How can I get by on one house? I need 5 houses, 10 houses. I need 3 jet planes to take me all over the world. Sorry, the American people. We've got the money. We've got the power. We've got the lobbyists here on Wall Street. Tough luck. That's the world. Get used to it. Rich get richer. Middle class shrinks. Not enough. Not enough. The very rich seem to want more and more and more, and they are prepared to dismantle the existing political and social order in order to get it. So you got economics and distribution of income and wealth is one thing, but then we're talking about politics. And what happened last year, as I think most Americans know, is the Supreme Court made a very strange decision. The Supreme Court decided that corporations are people. their people, and they have the right of free speech, and they have the right without disclosure. All of this is through the Citizens United Supreme Court decision that corporate heads can put as much money as they want into campaigns all over the country. In the last campaign, that's what we saw. Billionaires, in secret, just pouring money into campaigns all over this country. Now, does that sound like democracy to anybody in America? They got a handful of billionaires probably dividing up the country. Oh, we'll put this amount of money into Virginia and Vermont, California, wherever. But that's what they were able to do. So the rich get richer, and they don't sit on this money. What they then do is use it to elect people who support them, to unelect people who oppose their agenda, and they use their political power to get legislation passed which makes the wealthy even wealthier. Mr. President, one of the manifestations of that is, in fact, the agreement reached between the President and the Republican leadership. The wealthy contribute huge sums of money into campaign. The wealthy have all kinds of lobbyists around here, as the corporate America, and what they are going to get out of this agreement are huge, huge tax breaks that benefit themselves. And that is not what we should be supporting. As I mentioned earlier, we should understand that this legislation, this agreement, is really just the beginning of an assault on legislation and programs that have benefited the American people for 70 or 80 years. Mark my words, there will be an intensive effort to privatize Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid. Furthermore, as part of the Republican agenda, they want to expand, and it's not only Republicans here, I must say, some Democrats as well. They want to expand our disastrous trade policies so that large companies in this country can continue their efforts to outsource American jobs to China and other low-wage countries. I think any objective analysis of our trade policies have shown that it has been a grotesque failure for ordinary Americans. Hard to calculate exactly, but I think it is fair to say that we have lost millions of decent paying jobs. During the Bush years alone, some 48,000 factories in this country shut down. We went from 19 million manufacturing jobs to 12 million manufacturing jobs. And in this country, historically, manufacturing jobs were the backbone of the working class of this country. That's how people made it into the middle class. That's how they had decent health care benefits, decent pensions. And every day, we're seeing those jobs disappear because corporate America would prefer to do business in China or other low-wage countries. I returned from a trip to Vietnam last year, beautiful country. People there work for 25, 30 cents an hour. Sometimes when you go to a store, you may see a shirt made in Bangladesh. That shirt, in all likelihood, is made by a young girl who came in from the countryside into the city, one of the factories there. Now, the good news is that in Bangladesh, the minimum wage a number of months ago was doubled. Minimum wage in Bangladesh was doubled. It went from 11 cents an hour to 23 cents an hour. Are American workers going to be able to compete against desperate people who make 23 cents an hour? So my view, and I think it reflects the views of the American people, is that of course we want to see the people of Bangladesh and the people of China do well. But they don't have to do well at the expense of the American middle class. We do not have to engage in a race to the bottom. Our goal is to bring them up, not us down. But one of the results of our disastrous trade policies is that in many instances, wages in the United States have gone down. I believe that in the coming months, you're going to see an intensification of efforts to expand unfettered free trade. I think that will be a continuation of a disastrous policy for American workers. Let me just personalize this a little bit. This gentleman, no personal animus to him at all. I think I met him once in a large room. His name is Jamie Dimon. He is the CEO of J.P. Morgan Chase. Over the past 5 years, Mr. Dimon, who is the CEO of J.P. Morgan Chase, received $89 million in total compensation. A bank that we now know received hundreds of billions in low-interest loans and other financial assistance from the Federal Reserve and the Treasury Department. All right. So Mr. Dimon received $89 million in total compensation. His bank was bailed out big time by the taxpayers. But under the legislation that the president negotiated with the Republicans, Mr. Dimon, and I use him just as one example for thousands, nothing personal to Mr. Dimon here, will receive $1.1 million in tax breaks. $1.1 million in tax breaks for a major CEO on Wall Street who over the last 5 years received $89 million in total compensation. Meanwhile, there is, just to contrast what's going on here, 2 days ago, Mr. President, I brought before the Senate legislation which would provide a $250 one-time check to over 50 million seniors and disabled veterans who for the last 2 years have not received a COLA on their Social Security. Many of those seniors and disabled vets are trying to get by on $14,000, $15,000, $18,000 a year. The total package for that bill is approximately $14 billion that would go out to over 50 million seniors and disabled vets. We won that vote on the floor of the Senate 53 to 45. But just because you get 53 votes in the Senate doesn't really mean you win, because the Republicans filibustered. I needed 60 votes. I could not get 60 votes. I could not get one Republican vote to provide a $250 check to a disabled veteran trying to get by on $15,000 or $16,000 a year. But Mr. Dimon, who made $89 million in the last 5 years, will get a $1 million tax deduction if this agreement is passed. Now, that may make sense to some people. It does not make a lot of sense to me. And again, there are no particular knowledge animus. I don't know that I've ever met John Mack in my life. He is the CEO of Morgan Stanley. In 2006, he received a $40 million bonus, which at the time was the largest bonus ever given to a Wall Street executive. 2 years after receiving this bonus, Morgan Stanley received some $2 trillion in low-interest loans and billions from the Treasury Department. Instead of losing his job under this agreement, Mr. Mack will be receiving an estimated $926,000 tax break next year. Congratulations, Mr. Mack, you're doing just fine. Couldn't get $250 for a disabled vet. Mr. President, over the past 5 years, Ken Lewis, the former CEO of Bank of America, received over $165 million in total compensation. In 2008, Bank of America received hundreds of billions in taxpayer-backed loans from the Fed and a $45 billion bailout from the Treasury Department. What will Mr. Lewis receive if the agreement negotiated between the President and the Republicans goes forth? He will get a $713,000 tax cut. And on it goes. I didn't mean to specifically pick on these guys. There'll be some of the wealthiest people in the country will be receiving a $1 million plus tax break. And so we as a nation have got to decide whether or not that makes a lot of sense. I think it doesn't. Mr. President, let me mention that just a couple of weeks ago, the Federal Reserve, published on their website some 21,000 transactions that took place during the Wall Street meltdown period. And that disclosure was made possible as part of a provision that I put into the financial reform bill because I thought it was important that the American people, for the first time, lift the veil of secrecy at the Fed and get a sense of the kind of money that was lent out by the Fed and who received that money. Now, what's very interesting is that the American people and the media have focused on the $700 billion Wall Street bailout, now known as TARP. Now, I happen to have voted against that agreement, but in fairness, that agreement was pretty transparent. The Treasury Department put up on their website all of those people who received, all of those banks and financial institutions who received the money. If you want to know where the money went, it's right up there on the Treasury Department's website. But at the same time, a bigger transaction was taking place than TARP, which got relatively little attention, and that was the role that the Fed was playing in terms of the Wall Street bailout. While the TARP issue was being debated during that period, Ben Bernanke, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Tim Geithner, who was then the president of the New York Fed, and a handful of other very powerful people were sitting behind closed doors, getting ready to lend out trillions, underlying trillions of taxpayer dollars to large financial institutions and corporations with no debate going on in Congress, no debate whatsoever. Now, on March 3rd, 2009, and I'm a member of the Budget Committee, the Senate Budget Committee, I asked the Fed Chairman, Mr. Bernanke, to tell the American people the names of the financial institutions that received this unprecedented backdoor bailout from the Fed, how much they received, and the exact terms of this assistance. And I will never forget that. I asked Mr. Bernanke for that information. He said, Senator, nope, not going to give it to you. Not going to make it public. Well, on that day, I introduced legislation to make that information public, working with a number of members of the House and the Senate. Some strange bedfellows, very conservatives, progressives came together on this issue. We managed to get into the Wall Street reform bill a disclosure provision. And just on December 1st, last week, that information was made public. And let me talk a little bit about what was in that information made public by the Fed. After years of stonewalling, the American people have learned the incredible and jaw-dropping details of the Fed's multi-trillion-dollar bailout of Wall Street and corporate America, not just Wall Street, one of the things that we learned. As a result of this disclosure, in my view, and we're going to get into what was in what we learned, Congress has got to take a very extensive look at all aspects of how the Federal Reserve functions and how we can make our financial institutions more responsive to the needs of ordinary Americans and small businesses. Now, what have we learned from the disclosure of December 1st? And this is based on an examination of over 21,000 separate Federal Reserve transactions. More work, more research needs to be done, but this is what we have learned so far. As it turns out, while small business owners in the state of Vermont and throughout this country were being turned down for loans, not only did large financial institutions, and I'm talking about every major financial institution, receive substantial help from the Fed, but also some of the largest corporations in this country, not financial institutions, also received help in terms of very, very low interest loans. So you got every major financial institution, you got some of our largest private corporations, but here's something that we also learned, and that is that this bailout impacted not just American banks and corporations, but also foreign banks and foreign corporations as well, to the tune of many, many billions of dollars. And then on top of that, a number of the wealthiest individuals in this country also received a major bailout from the Fed. The emergency response, which is what the Fed described their action as during the Wall Street collapse, appears to any objective observer to have been the clearest case that I can imagine of socialism for the very rich and rugged free market capitalism for everybody else. In other words, if you are a huge financial institution whose recklessness and greed caused this great recession, no problem. You are going to receive a substantial amount of help from the taxpayers of this country. If you are a major American corporation, like General Electric, or McDonald's, or Caterpillar, or Harley-Davidson, or Verizon, no problem. You are going to receive a major handout from the United States government. But if you are a small business in Vermont, or in California, or Virginia, well, guess what? You're on your own. Because right now, we know that one of the real impediments to the kind of job creation that we need in this country is that small businesses are not getting the loans they need. Furthermore, what we now know is the extent of the bailout for the large financial corporations. Goldman Sachs received nearly $600 billion. Morgan Stanley received nearly $2 trillion. Citigroup received $1.8 trillion. Bear Stearns received nearly $1 trillion, and Merrill Lynch received some $1.5 trillion in short-term loans from the Fed. But I think what is most surprising for the American people is not just the bailout of Wall Street and the financial institutions and the bailout of large American corporations like General Electric, but I think the American people would find it very strange that at a time when the American automobile sector was on the verge of collapse, and goodness only knows how many thousands and thousands of jobs we have lost in automobile manufacturing in this country, that the Federal Reserve was also bailing out Toyota and Mitsubishi, two Japanese car makers, by purchasing nearly $5 billion worth of their commercial paper from November 5th, 2008 through January 30th, 2009. While virtually no American-made cars or products of any kind are bought in Japan, I think the American people would be shocked to learn that the Fed extended over $380 billion to the Central Bank of Japan to bail out banks in that country. Furthermore, I think the American people are interested to know that the Fed bailed out the Korea Development Bank, the wholly owned state-owned bank of South Korea, by purchasing over $2 billion of its commercial paper. The sole purpose of the Korea Development Bank is to finance and manage major industrial projects to enhance the national economy, not of the United States of America, but of South Korea. I'm not against South Korea. I wish the South Koreans all the luck in the world. But it should not be the taxpayers of the United States lending their banks money to create jobs in South Korea. I would suggest that maybe we want to create jobs in the United States of America. At the same time, the Fed also extended over $40 billion to the Central Bank of South Korea so that it had enough money to bail out its own banks. Now, Mr. President, at a time when small businesses all over this country, in Vermont, all over this country, cannot get the loans they need to expand their businesses, I think the American people would find it extremely, I don't know what the word is, maybe amusing, that the Fed bailed out the state-owned bank of Bavaria. Bavaria, it's not Pennsylvania, not California, Bavaria, by purchasing over $2.2 billion of its commercial paper. Furthermore, when we cannot get support on the floor of this Senate to extend unemployment benefits to millions of Americans who are on the verge of seeing them expire, I think the American people would find it incomprehensible that the Fed chose to bail out the Arab banking corporation based in Bahrain by providing them with over $23 billion in loans with an interest rate as low as 0.25%. So small businessmen all over America, maybe you better run to Bahrain and work with the Arab banking corporation there. You get some pretty good loans. But it would be a nice thing, I think, if maybe the Fed would start to pay attention to banks in this country. Furthermore, the Fed extended over $9.6 billion to the Central Bank of Mexico. Now, what's interesting about all of this, Mr. President, is that we had a very, very vigorous debate here in the Senate and in the House over the $700 billion TARP program. Every person in America could turn on C-SPAN and hear that debate, hear what President Bush had to say, hear what then Senator Obama had to say, Senator McCain had to say. It was all pretty public. But what took place at the Fed, which in fact amounted to a larger bailout, was done behind closed doors. Over $3 trillion was lent out with zero transparency. In fact, as a result of this recent disclosure, this is the first time we have gotten a glimpse of the magnitude and the particulars, the specificities of where that money was lent out. And I think this is not a good thing for this country. Again, I voted against the bailout of Wall Street, but the debate was open, it was public, people wrote to their senators, called their senators. That's called democracy. After the TARP bailout took place, all of the loans were put up on the website. Transparency, the American people knew who got the money. But the actions of the Fed were done behind closed doors, and in my view, it's an issue we're studying right now, I think that there were significant conflicts of interest. I think you had people sitting there at the New York Fed who were beneficiaries of this bailout, and that is just an issue that we've got to explore. And I should tell you, Mr. President, that as part of the provision we got into the financial reform bill, the GAO is in fact doing just that, investigating possible conflicts of interest at the Fed with regard to this bailout. But I think the question that the American people are asking as they read about what the Fed did during the financial crisis is whether or not the Fed has now become the central bank of the world without any debate on the floor of the United States Senate or the Congress and without the knowledge of the American people. And I think that that is wrong. So I would hope that out of this effort in bringing disclosure and transparency to the Fed, that one of the things that will come will be more transparency at the Fed. Mr. President, as I indicated a moment ago, the Fed said that this bailout was necessary in order to prevent the world economy from going over a cliff. But 3 years after the start of the recession, millions of Americans remain unemployed and have lost their homes, their life savings, and their ability to send their kids to college. Meanwhile, huge banks, large corporations have returned to making incredible profits and paying their executives record-breaking compensation packages as if the financial crisis they started never occurred. What this recent disclosure tells us, among many other things, is that despite this huge taxpayer bailout, the Fed did not make the appropriate demands on these financial institutions, which would have been necessary to rebuild our economy and protect the needs of ordinary Americans. In other words, what they simply did is give out billions and billions of dollars, which were used in the self-interests of these financial institutions, rather than saying the American people who are hurting are bailing you out, and now that we've bailed you out, your responsibility is to do what you can do to create jobs and to improve the standard of living of the people, many of whose lives you have severely impacted. And let me just give you a few examples of what could have been done and what should be done. At a time when big banks have nearly $1 trillion in excess reserves parked at the Fed has not required these institutions to increase lending to small and medium-sized businesses as the condition of the bailout. In other words, instead of just giving money to the Fed, instead of the Fed just giving money to these financial institutions, the Fed should have said, we're giving you this money in order to get it into the economy. Start providing affordable loans to small businesses. President, at a time when large corporations are more profitable than ever, the Fed did not demand that corporations that received this backdoor bailout create jobs and expand the economy once they return to profitability. So what's going on in America? Unemployment officially at 9.8, in real sense probably at 15, 16%. Wall Street is now doing fine. A few years ago, Wall Street earned some 40% of all profits in America. They're doing great. But what the Fed should have done and should do now is to tell Wall Street, you're part of the economy. You're not an isolated area just living for yourselves. You've got to be part of the productive economy. You got to lend out money to small businesses to start creating jobs. Mr. President, my office intends to investigate whether these secret Fed loans, in some cases, turned out to be direct corporate welfare to big banks that may have used those loans not to reinvest in the economy, but rather to lend back to the federal government at a higher rate of interest by purchasing Treasury securities. Now, we don't know that. Maybe that's true, maybe it's not true, but we'll take a look at it. In other words, did the Fed give 0.5% loans to a bank, and that bank then purchase a Treasury security at 2 or 3%? If so, you got a 2% profit margin. and that is nothing but corporate welfare. The goal of the bailout was not to make Wall Street richer. The goal was to expand our economy and put people to work. Furthermore, Mr. President, you know, as part of the TARP agreement, there was an effort to say to the financial institutions that we're not bailing you out in order for you to get huge compensation packages. We're not going to give you federal money so that you can make all kinds of money. We put limitations on executive compensation. Did the Fed play the role of allowing some of the large financial institutions to pay back the TARP money, use the Fed money, and then continue with their very, very high executive compensation? Don't know that. It is worth investigating. Furthermore, Mr. President, and this is an issue that I have worked on for a number of years. You know, every major religion on earth, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, you name it, has always felt that usury was immoral. Usury. What we mean by usury is that when somebody doesn't have a whole lot of money and you lend them money, you don't take blood out of a stone. You don't ask for outrageously high interest rates when somebody is hurting. That's immoral. Every major religion. All great philosophers have written about this. And yet today, Mr. President, we have millions of people in our country, and I hear from Vermonters every week on this issue, who are paying 25 or 30%, and in some cases even higher interest rates on their credit cards. 25, 30% interest rates. That is getting blood out of a stone. And yet, many of the credit card companies were bailed out by the taxpayers of this country. What the Fed must do is say to those companies, sorry, you can't continue to rip off the American people and charge them 25 or 30% interest rates. Now, as it happens, the four largest banks in this country, which are Bank of America, JP Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, and Citigroup, issue half of all mortgages in this country. Four huge financial institutions issue half of all mortgages in this country. Now that unto itself is a huge problem. They issue half of all mortgages, 2/3 of all credit cards. And that speaks to another issue about the need to start breaking up these financial institutions. But when you have a handful of banks who have received huge bailouts from the federal government, who are issuing 2/3 of the credit cards in this country, it seems to me to be somewhat absurd that the Fed did not say to them, sorry, you can't charge people 25 or 30% interest rates on their credit cards. And the same principle applies to the mortgages. I don't have to tell anybody in this country that we have seen millions of folks lose their homes through foreclosure. And once again, we see the four largest banks in this country, Bank of America, JP Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, and Citigroup, issue half of all mortgages in this country. Four banks issue 2/3 of the credit cards, half of the mortgages. We bail these financial institutions out. Don't they have some responsibility to the American people? How many more Americans could have remained in their homes if the Fed required those bailed out banks to reduce mortgage payments as a condition of receiving these secret loans? In terms of the interest rates on credit cards, a lot of people don't know this, but right now, the banks are able to charge as much as they want to charge, but in fact, credit unions are not. Right now, we are looking at a situation where over 1/4 of all credit card holders in this country are now paying interest rates above 20%, and in some cases as high as 79%. And in my view, Mr. President, when credit card companies charge over 20% interest, they are not engaged in the business of making credit available to their customers. They are involved in extortion and loan sharking. Nothing essentially different than gangsters who charge outrageously high prices for their loans and who break kneecaps when their victims can't afford to pay them. So that's where we are right now. I get calls, and I'm sure every other senator gets calls, from constituents who are really upset. They're going deeper and deeper into debt because they can't pay 25 or 30% interest rates on their credit cards. We bailed out the credit card companies. There was no provision that said, stop ripping off the American people, stop these companies from committing usury. And we are working on legislation which would say to these private banks not to charge any more money for the credit that they provide than do the credit unions. It's going to be a tough fight because the lobbyists from Wall Street are all over this place. Wall Street spends huge amounts of money in campaign contributions, and it's going to be tough. But I think we need to pass that. I think the Fed needs to be much more active in terms of what kind of interest rates credit card companies should be paying. Mr. President, today I'm going to focus a lot, obviously, on an agreement reached between the President and the Republican leadership that I think does not serve the American people well. And one of the areas, as I mentioned earlier, where I think we could do a lot better in addressing the crisis of high unemployment in this nation is by investing the kinds of money we need in our infrastructure. According to the American Society of Civil Engineers, they graded America's roads, public transit, and aviation with a D and said that we must invest $2.2 trillion over the next 5 years simply to get a passable condition. Unfortunately, in the agreement struck between the President and the Republican leadership, to the best of my knowledge, not one nickel is going into investing in our infrastructure. And let me tell you why we need to invest in infrastructure. A, that's where you can create the millions of jobs that we desperately need in order to get us out of this recession. But second of all, we need to invest in infrastructure because if we don't, we will become less and less competitive internationally. According to the National Surface Transportation Policy and Revenue Study Commission, $225 billion is needed annually for the next 50 years to upgrade our surface transportation system to a state of good repair and create a more advanced system. The Federal Highway Administration reports that $130 billion must be invested annually for a 20-year period to improve our bridges and the operational performance of our highways. At present, Mr. President, 1 in 4 of the nation's bridges are either structurally deficient or functionally obsolete. 1 in 4 of our bridges are either structurally deficient or functionally obsolete. And yet, in this agreement struck by the President and the Republican leadership, to the best of my knowledge, not one nickel is going into our infrastructure. We need to invest in our infrastructure. We need to improve our infrastructure. And when we do that, we can create millions of jobs. Mr. President, the Federal Transit Administration says that $22 billion must be invested annually for a 20-year period to improve conditions and performances for our major transit systems. In my state of Vermont, the situation is no different than in the rest of the country. 35% of Vermont's 2,700 bridges, nearly 1,000 bridges, are functionally obsolete. In recent years, we've had to shut down bridges, which caused a lot of inconvenience to people who lived in those areas, to workers who had to get to work using a bridge. Nearly half of the bridges in the state of Vermont have structural deficiencies. Rural transit options are few and far between, making rural low-income Vermonters especially vulnerable to spikes in gas prices. In other words, in Vermont and in other areas of rural America, you have one choice in the vast majority of cases as to how you get to work. And that one choice is you get in your car, you pay $3 for a gallon of gas, and that is it. And that's because rural transportation in this country is very, very weak. We can create jobs building the buses, building the vans that we need, making it easier, cheaper for workers in rural America to get to work. Urban area, not different. Subways, New York City, Chicago, right here in Washington, D.C., are in disrepair. Let's improve, let's expand. Our public transportation system makes America run better, makes us more efficient, makes us more productive, more competitive, and it creates jobs now. Not one nickel, as far as I can understand, has been invested in our infrastructure in this agreement. Mr. President, the United States invests just 2.4% of GDP in infrastructure. 2.4%, whereas Europe invests twice that amount. And here is something that I think every American should be keenly aware of and very worried about. I don't have to tell anybody that the Chinese economy is exploding every single day in almost every way. In China, they are investing almost 4 times our rate, or 9% of their GDP annually in their infrastructure. Years ago, I was in Shanghai, in China, and I was coming from the airport to downtown as part of a congressional delegation. And while we were on the bus coming in, my wife noticed something. She says, "What was that?" There was a blur that went right by the window. I, of course, didn't notice it. She did. Turned out that that blur was an experimental train that they were working on, high-speed rail, which is now operational there, but is similar prototypes are being developed all over China. So here we are, the United States of America, which for so many years has led the world in so many ways. And now you're seeing a newly developing country like China, high-speed rail all over their country, making their country more productive and efficient. And in our cities, our subways are breaking down. Amtrak is going 50 miles an hour, 60 miles an hour. And the Chinese, the Europeans have trains that are going hundreds of miles an hour. This is the United States of America. Maybe I'm old-fashioned. I think we could do it too. I think we could rebuild our rail system, make our country more efficient, and create jobs. Mr. President, China invested $186 billion in rail from 2006 through 2009, and according to the New York Times, within 2 years, they will open 42 new high-speed rail lines with trains reaching speeds of 200 miles an hour. That's China. So I think, Mr. President, if China can do it, the United States of America can do it. That's the way to rebuild America, make us stronger, and create jobs. By 2020, China plans to add 26,000 additional miles of tracks for freight and travel, as well as 230,000 miles of new or improved roads and 97 new airports. 97 new airports. Anybody in America have the same problem that I have when you go to the airport? and you're waiting on lines, and you have to deal with all of the problems of older airports. China's building 97 new ones. We're not. We're not. And if we are going to be effective in the international economy, if our kids are going to have decent jobs, it's high time that we woke up and began investing in our infrastructure. So that is not only to improve the long-term strength of America, our economic prowess, but it is also to create jobs right now when we desperately need to do that. But unfortunately, in this bill, this tax agreement between the president and the Republican leadership, there are many, many billions of dollars going into tax breaks for corporations, but there is not a whole lot of money. In fact, there's $0 going into rebuilding our infrastructure. And similarly, and I know there's been debate just yesterday on this issue, there may be a small breakthrough here, small breakthrough. But I don't have to, again, tell Americans, least of all the people in the state of Vermont, about what happens when the weather gets cold and you're forced to pay very high prices for heating oil. The time is long overdue for us to make the investments that we need to transform our energy system away from coal, away from oil. We are spending as a nation, and everybody in America has got to appreciate this. We're spending $350 billion every single year, $1 billion a day roughly, importing oil from Saudi Arabia and from other foreign countries in order to make our economy go and in order to keep people warm. $350 billion a year. And let me be very clear. The royal family of Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia is our major source of oil, they are doing just fine. Don't worry about the royal family of Saudi Arabia. They got zillions and zillions of dollars. Maybe it's a good idea that we move to energy independence, that we broke our dependence on fossil fuel, that we became far more energy efficient, which, by the way, investing in public transportation certainly will do. And we move to such sustainable energies as wind, solar, geothermal, and biomass. And by the way, guess what? That's what China is doing. Many of the solar panels that are coming into this country, not made in the United States of America, made in China. They're big inward wind turbines. So I think, Mr. President, that the time is now for us to rebuild our infrastructure and create the jobs that we desperately do. And again, unfortunately, despite the enormous needs, infrastructural needs in this country, this agreement signed by the President and the Republican leadership does not do that. And when we talk about transforming our energy system and moving away from fossil fuels and making our homes more energy efficient and building solar panels, moving toward solar thermal power in the southwest of this country, in New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, we have some of the best solar exposure in the entire world. There are estimates that just in the southwest of this country, on federal land, we can provide 30% of the electricity that American homes need if we move toward solar thermal. Need to invest in our transmission lines. So, Mr. President, what we are talking about here is massive investments to create jobs, make us energy independent, clean up the environment, deal with the huge amount of greenhouse gas emissions which are contributing to global warming. That's a win-win-win situation. And yet, we are not seeing that in this bill. And I will want to tell you something, Mr. President. I'm going to get into this at greater length later. And that is when we talk about our good friends in the oil industry, and I'm not here to make a long speech about BP and what they've done in Louisiana, etc. But I want everybody to know this. I'm going to get into this at greater length later. Last year, our friends at ExxonMobil, and ExxonMobil has historically been the most profitable corporation in the history of the world. Last year, ExxonMobil had, for them, a very bad year. They only made $19 billion in profit. Mr. President, based on $19 billion You might be surprised to know that ExxonMobil not only paid nothing in taxes, they got a $156 million return from the IRS. Now, how's that? For those of you who are working in an office, you're working in a factory, you're earning your $30, $40, $50, $60,000 a year, you pay taxes. But if you are ExxonMobil and you made $19 billion in taxes, in profits last year, not only did you not pay any taxes this year, you got a $156 million return. That's pretty good, I think. Mr. President, it's not just the large oil companies who do not pay their fair share of taxes. I'm getting into this a little bit later. But when we understand, or try to understand, why we have such a huge national debt and a $1.3 or $4 trillion deficit, it's also important to understand that many large and profitable corporations avoid virtually all of their tax responsibility. In August 2008, the General Accountability Office here issued a report. And according to this report, 2 out of every 3 corporations in the United States paid no federal income taxes between 1998 and 2005. Well, we got a $13.7 trillion national debt, and according to a GAO report published in August of 2008, 2 out of every 3 corporations in the United States paid no federal income taxes between 1998 and 2005. Amazingly, these corporations had a combined $2.5 trillion in sales, but paid no income taxes to the IRS. Furthermore, according to a report from Citizens for Tax Justice, 82 Fortune 500 companies in America, I guess that's 82 out of 500, paid 0 or less in federal income taxes in at least 1 year from 2001 to 2003. That's a report from Citizens for Tax Justice. And the Citizens for Tax Justice report goes on to say, and I quote, "In the years they paid no income tax, these companies earned $102 billion in U.S. profits. But instead of paying $35.6 billion in income taxes, as the statutory 35% corporate tax rate seems to require, these companies generated so many excess tax breaks that they received outright tax rebate checks from the U.S. Treasury totaling $12.6 billion. That's from the Citizens for Tax Justice. So, Mr. President, when we take a comprehensive look at what is going on in this country, why we have a $13.7 trillion national debt, it is terribly important to understand that while the middle class pays its share of taxes, there are many, many, many large corporations that not only are paying nothing in taxes, they are getting rebates from the federal government. I'm going to go on to this at greater length later on. But there, as a member of the Budget Committee, I can tell you, we discuss quite often about how every single year, corporate interests and wealthy individuals stash away huge amounts of money in tax havens in the Cayman Islands, Bermuda, and other countries in order to avoid paying their taxes in the United States of America. These are American corporations turning their backs on the American people, saying, as Mrs. Helmsley said so many years ago, I guess many of you remember, only small people pay taxes. Only the working stiffs out there pay taxes. If you're a large corporation, you got a good lawyer, you know what you do, good accountant. Invest your money in the Cayman Islands and in Bermuda. You don't have to pay American taxes. But by the way, as the disclosure report of last week indicated, no problem, you get bailed out. When things go bad, you will be bailed out by American taxpayers. So, Mr. President, on and on and on it goes. The rich and large corporations get richer. The CEOs earn huge compensation packages. When things get bad, don't worry. Uncle Sam and the American taxpayers are here to bail you out. But when you are in trouble, well, we just can't afford to help you if you're the working class or the middle class of this country. Mr. President, I want to return for a moment to the agreement that the President and the Republican leadership negotiated. Because I think that is the issue that all of America is now talking about. President, Republican leadership says it's a good deal. Democrats in the House yesterday said, wait a second. Doesn't look to us like it's a good deal. In fact, we don't even want to bring it up to the floor of the House. And I can tell you that here in the Senate, there are a number of us, I don't know how many, who say, wait a second, this ain't a good deal for the middle class, not a good deal for our kids, not a good deal for workers. We can negotiate a better deal. And the reason we are trying to delay passage of this agreement, and I hope very much it doesn't have the votes here, is we want the American people to stand up and say, wait a second, it makes no sense to us to be giving huge tax breaks to the richest people in this country, literally millionaires and billionaires, driving up the national debt so that our kids could pay more in taxes in order to pay that debt off. This is a transfer of wealth. It's Robin Hood in reverse. We're taking from the middle class and working families, and we're giving it to the wealthiest people in this country. So, Mr. President, I believe that the agreement struck between the President and the Republican leadership is a bad deal, some good parts to it, but by and large, it is not a good deal. We can do better. And if the American people stand up and work with us, if they get on the phones, if they call up their senators, they call up their congressmen, if they make their voices heard and said enough is enough, the rich have got it all right now. Top 1% earns 23.5% of all income, more than the bottom 50%, that it is absurd that we continue to bail out people who do not need any help. We're doing just fine. So, Mr. President, I am here to take a stand against this bill, and I'm going to do everything I can to defeat this bill. And I'm going to tell my colleagues and the American people exactly why, in my view, this is not good legislation. And let me just tick off some of the reasons why I think that this bill does not serve the best interest of the disappearing middle class of this country. And I should tell you, Mr. President, I don't know what kind of telephone calls you're getting from Colorado, but I can tell you that in the last 3 days alone, according to my front desk staff, both here in Washington and Vermont, I think we're over 5,000 telephone calls and emails, and well over 98% of those messages are against this agreement. And I don't know to what degree that's indicative of what's going on all over this country, but I suspect it is not radically different in other states. I think the American people are saying $13.8 trillion national debt. Let's not give tax breaks to billionaires, drive up that national debt, force our kids to pay more in taxes, and at the same time have Republicans come forward and start slashing Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security because of this large debt that we are making larger. And I appeal to my conservative friends. I'm not a conservative, but many conservatives have spent their entire political careers saying we cannot afford to drive up the national debt. It's unsustainable. I agree with that. So vote against this agreement because it is driving up the national debt. And in a significant way, it is doing that by giving tax breaks to people who absolutely don't need it. Once again, for those people who are earning $1 million a year or more, they on average, will be getting about $100,000 a year tax break. People earning $100 million a year, that number is going to be a lot higher. Who believes that that makes any sense at all? Mr. President, let me give you some other reasons why I think this agreement is a bad agreement. The President says, well, yes, we are going to extend tax breaks for all, including the top 2%. But don't worry, it's only going to be for 2 years. Not to worry, only going to be for 2 years. Well, maybe that will be the case, but you know what? I doubt that very much. I've been here in Congress long enough to know that if you extend a tax break, it is very, very hard to undo that extension. Because if we can't do it now, if we can't tell our Republican colleagues that it is absurd to continue giving tax breaks to millionaires and billionaires, if we can't do it now, what makes you think we're going to do it in the midst of a presidential election? And I have to say that as somebody who admires and likes the president. The president is a friend of mine. His credibility has been severely damaged. He's going to go forward, and if he's the Democratic nominee, I suspect that he will say, well, yeah, I extended it for 2 years against my will, but don't worry. I'm going to repeal him after 2 years. Mr. President, you tell me who's going to believe him. His credibility has been severely damaged. We're caving in on this issue. We should not be. The polls show us the American people do not believe millionaires and billionaires need more tax breaks. If the calls to my office are indicative of what's going on in this country, overwhelming opposition to that agreement. So what I'm saying here is that while the president says, don't worry, this is only temporary. Yeah, I don't like it, says the president. Don't like it, but it's only 2 years. I have my doubts. I expect that in 2 years, if this agreement goes forward, it will be extended again. As you know, Mr. President, they wanted 10 years of an extension of tax breaks for the rich. I have my strong suspicion that that is exactly what will happen if not made permanent. And this country cannot afford to give tax breaks to millionaires and billionaires and have the middle class pay higher taxes to pay them off. And I want to say also, Mr. President, that while a lot of attention has been focused on the personal income tax issue, that is not the only unfair tax proposal in this agreement. This agreement continues the Bush-era 15% tax rate on capital gains and dividends. Meaning, let's be very clear about what this means, meaning that those people who make their living off of their investments, if you invest, if you earn dividends, will continue to pay a substantially lower tax rate than the average American worker. Person in the working class, middle class, our firemen, our teachers, our nurses. Those people are not going to pay 15%. They pay a higher rate than folks who have capital gains and dividends. I think that that's wrong. This agreement extends those provisions. Furthermore, Mr. President, and this is a point that has got to be made over and over and over again, this agreement between the President and the Republicans lowers the estate tax rate to 35%. Under this agreement, the estate tax will decline to 35%. Under President Clinton, when the economy was much stronger, the estate tax was 55%. Now, I know, Mr. President, that the Republicans have done a very good job in trying to convince the American people that this is a so-called death tax, that in every family in America, when a loved one dies, the family is going to have to pay 35%, 45%, 55%. I have had people in Burlington, Vermont coming up to me and say, what are you doing? I got $30,000 in the bank. I want to leave it to my kids. Why are you forcing my kids to pay such a large tax? So let us be very, very clear. The Republicans have done a very good job in totally distorting this issue. The estate tax is paid only by the top 0.3% of families in America. If you are in the middle class, even if you're modestly wealthy, even if you're wealthy, if you're poor, if you're lower middle class, you don't pay a nickel in estate tax if somebody in your family were to die and leave you wealth. Not a nickel. This applies not just to the rich, but the very, very, very rich. So what the Republicans have been arguing for several years now is they want to repeal the estate tax entirely. If they were successful in doing that, Mr. President, that would mean increasing the national debt by $1 trillion over a 10-year period. How's that? And all of the benefits, not some, all of the benefits go to the top 0.3%. 99.7% of the people do not gain one nickel. Now, what's in this agreement is not what the Republicans ideally want, which is a repeal of the tax entirely, but what they do get is a reduction to 35% with an exemption on the first $5 million of an individual's estate. And here, Mr. President, is a chart which indicates just what I said a moment ago. Repealing the estate tax would add more than $1 trillion to the deficit over 10 years. Over $1 trillion, and the beneficiaries of it are just the very, very wealthy. Mr. President, let me give you an example of what the repeal of the estate tax would be. I'll read it right off of this chart right here. Sam Walton's family, and those are the heirs to the Walmart fortune, are worth an estimated $86.8 billion. The Walton family, one family, would receive an estimated $32.7 billion tax break if the estate tax was completely repealed. And this is what our Republican friends want. Now, this agreement between the President and Republicans certainly does not repeal the estate tax, but it does significantly lower the rates that the richest people, very richest people in this country, would have to pay. Mr. President, 2 days ago, I brought to the floor of this Senate a very simple piece of legislation, and I think how that legislation was treated speaks volumes about the debate that we're having now. This legislation said that with over 50 million senior citizens on Social Security and disabled vets, for the second year in a row not getting a cost of living adjustment, a COLA, over 50 million seniors on Social Security, disabled vets, not getting any COLA at all, despite the fact that their prescription drug costs are going up, their health care costs are going up. They got no COLA. And I said, I think in these tough times, it is appropriate, those folks, if we can't get them a COLA, 2% COLA, $250 check to all of our seniors, disabled vets. That's what we did, by the way, in the stimulus package. That's all. Over 50 million people, $250 check, cost our government about $14 billion. $14 billion. And yet, I could not get one Republican vote in support of that. Republicans say, my goodness, imagine a senior or disabled vet living on $15,000, $20,000 a year, getting a $250 check. What an outrage. We have different priorities, they say. We want to give $1 million tax break to somebody who earns $50 million a year. And that about says it all. If you're very, very rich, good news is you're going to get more tax breaks. But if you're a senior or a disabled vet, we can't get you a $250 check. Now, I will say, Mr. President, that the vote here on the floor of the Senate was 53 people in favor of providing that one-time check, 45 against. 53 to 45. We won. But here in the Senate, majority does not rule. Republicans filibuster almost everything, and it required 60 votes. We didn't get the 60 votes. Seniors didn't get that check. I'm going to do my best to see that they do get it. We're going to bring that issue back and back and back again. So I raise that issue, Mr. President, to tell you that one of the very weakest proposals in this agreement, totally outrageous, is the decrease in the taxes for the estate tax. Now, there's another issue I want to touch on, and I'm going to spend a long time on this issue because it hasn't gotten the coverage and the attention that I think it deserves. And this agreement deals with the so-called this agreement deals with the payroll tax holiday. And I know the president, the vice president, and others have been touting this, and they're saying, well, you know, this is really a good thing because we're going to put more money into the pockets of working people. What will happen is if you're a worker right now, you're paying 6.2% in a payroll tax for Social Security. It's going to be reduced for 1 year to 4.2%. You get the difference, and this is really a good thing. Well, all of us want to see working people have more money in their pockets. That's what we're doing. That's what we're fighting for. But let me be very clear that while on the surface, this so-called payroll tax holiday sounds like a good idea for working people, it is actually a very bad idea. And what the American people should understand is that this payroll tax holiday originated from right-wing Republicans whose ultimate goal, trust me, is not to put more money into the pockets of working families. It's the ultimate destruction of Social Security. And what they understand is that if we divert funding that is supposed to go into the Social Security Trust Fund, this will ultimately weaken the long-term financial viability of Social Security. So in other words, what we are doing is, for the very first time, diverting money which is supposed to go into the Social Security Trust Fund. We're giving it to workers today. It's like eating our seed. Rather than going into Social Security, President says, don't worry, this is going to be covered this year by the federal government. Well, we've never seen that before. I don't want Social Security to be dependent on the federal government, because the federal government has a $13.7 trillion national debt. And what I worry about is this is not just a one-year provision. This also could be extended. Let me just quote Barbara Kennelly, and I'm glad to see that I'm joined here on the floor by one of the strongest fighters in the United States Senate for Working Families, Senator Sherrod Brown of Ohio. And I just want to say this before I ask him a question, or before he asks me a question, or whatever the protocol is. And that is, I want to quote what Barbara Kennelly, the president and CEO of the National Committee to Preserve Social Security and Medicare, said. This is one of the largest senior groups in America, and this is what she says, and I quote, "Even though Social Security contributed nothing to the current economic crisis, it has been bartered in a deal that provides deficit-busting tax cuts for the wealthy." Here's the key point. Diverting $120 billion in Social Security contributions for a so-called tax holiday may sound like a good deal for workers now, but it's bad business for the program that a majority of middle-class seniors will rely upon in the future. End of quote. Barbara Kennelly, President and CEO of the National Committee to Preserve Social Security and Medicare. I'm joined now by my very good friend from Ohio, and I wanted to ask him his sense of this overall agreement.
Well, my sense is similar to yours in that I was just on a TV show a minute ago, and I was asked, the liberals or the conservatives, what they think about this. And this really isn't a liberal conservative issue. This is, first of all, the tax cuts overwhelmingly go to the wealthiest taxpayers. We're seeing the kinds of tax cuts that millionaires and billionaires get from the income tax and from the estate tax. But it's also, equally importantly, it blows a hole in our budget deficit. In some sense, we're borrowing tens of billions of dollars every year now. If this agreement becomes law, we're borrowing tens of billions of dollars every year from the Chinese. We're putting it on our children's and our grandchildren's credit cards for them to pay off who knows when, and then we're giving these tax cuts to millionaires and billionaires. I mean, just in those simple terms, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense in our relationship with China. It doesn't make sense in the lost jobs that come from that China trade policy. It doesn't make sense in undermining the middle class. It doesn't make sense in terms of fairness in the tax system. And it doesn't make sense for our children and grandchildren and what the burden they're going to have to bear to pay off this debt. I mean, when giving a millionaire a tax cut and charging it to our kids who are paying taxes on unfortunately in the last few years declining wages is just morally reprehensible. And when I think of I know Senator Sanders has been on the floor 2 hours now on talking about this and how important and really analyzing it and educating and all that. I think about the economic policy too that this embodies. 9 years ago, Senator Sanders and the presiding officer, when he was a member of the House, Senator Udall from Colorado, and I and others voted against the Bush tax cuts of 2001 and 2003, principally because those tax cuts overwhelmingly went to the wealthy and ended up adding to our national debt. We had a surplus then. We sure don't now. We had the largest surplus we'd ever had in 2001. Blew a hole in that. But we passed those tax cuts under the belief, those who supported it, President Bush and Senator McConnell and so many others, under the belief that kind of trickle-down economics would grow our economy. Well, in the 8 years, and this isn't partisan, this isn't opinion, this is fact, from January 1, 2001 to January 1, 2009, President Bush's 8 years, we actually had private sector job loss in this country. Contrast that with a different economic policy, January 1, 1993 to January 1, 2001, the Clinton 8 years. Again, this isn't partisan, this isn't opinion, this is fact. During the Clinton 8 years, we had 21 million private sector jobs created. 21 million private sector jobs created, zero, literally, job loss. Private sector jobs created in the Bush 8 years because of trickle-down economics. So why would we blow a hole in the budget, which this bill does? Why would we, for our kids to pay off, and why would we continue an economic policy that clearly didn't work for this country? Didn't work for the middle class. We saw the middle class. We saw wages. Not only no job increase during those 8 years, except for the people at the very top, we saw actual wage stagnation or worse. Most Americans didn't get a raise during the 8 Bush years. Most Americans simply saw their wages flat or in many cases decline. The super wealthy saw a big increase in their incomes and in their net assets, and now we're going to give a tax break to them. I mean, this isn't class warfare. I have lots of people I know that have a lot of money. I don't aim ill will at them, but why would we help those people who have done so very well and then have our children pay for it? Now, Senator Sanders had just mentioned the letter from Barbara Kennelly, the Social Security, one of the largest seniors organizations in the country, and what this will mean for Social Security. And here's my fear, Mr. President, that if this is passed, we're going to see our budget deficit increase, according to the Congressional Budget Office, about $900 billion because of this package, $800-some billion over the next couple of years. As soon as it's signed by President Obama, even though it was negotiated with the Republican Senate leadership and overwhelming numbers of Republicans in the Senate and House, I assume, are going to vote for it, they're going to say, look at the huge budget deficit that President Obama created. from that day on, they're going to go after ways to cut the budget. That's okay. I agree. We need to deal with spending and taxes and the whole picture. But I also know from watching Republicans, I saw them in the House when they moved towards Medicare privatization in 2003 and 4 and 5. They had some success. Fortunately, we were able to beat back most of it. I remember in 2005, after President Bush was reelected in a very, very close race, he spoke repeatedly about privatizing Social Security. I know that's what they want to do. In the 1990s, Speaker Gingrich, fortunately beat back by President Clinton, but Speaker Gingrich tried to privatize Medicare. And that's the way they cut the budget. They go after Medicare and Social Security. So this vote on this package, and to me, it's, you know, we need to call the president, to write to the president, to work with the president, to say no deal, and that this has got to be something very different from what it is now, because it will cause huge deficits that our children and grandchildren will have to bear. It will not help the economy appreciably, because we saw what the trickle-down economic policies of the Bush years did, and it doesn't help the middle class enough. So it's pretty clear to me how this jeopardizes Social Security, it jeopardizes Medicare, it will force more cuts and more pressure on those programs that have lifted so many people into the middle class. In 1965, when Medicare was first passed, half of senior citizens in this country had no health insurance. Half of seniors had no health insurance. Today, 99% of seniors have health insurance, something like that. And I know that we're a country now that has created a strong middle class. We've seen that middle class because of these tax cuts for the wealthy, trickle-down kind of economic policy. We've seen the middle class shrink in the last few years. I don't want that to keep happening. That's why I'm very concerned about this. That's why I am working with the president to say no deal, that we need to much more seriously focus on not running up a huge debt, on making sure that Social Security is protected, on an economic policy that works for the middle class, and on a tax policy that's fair to the middle class. That's why Senator Sanders' work is so important on the floor today, taking the floor for a longer period than anybody I've seen since I've been in the Senate, in a filibuster kind of setting where he is he is raising these questions, asking these questions, educating the public, talking to people all over the country in this chamber and outside to change this policy.
If I could interrupt my friend from Ohio and ask him a question. This is an issue that he dealt with last night. Talk about the kind of priorities that we have seen in the Senate recently, where just a couple of days ago, you and I worked very hard to try to make sure that seniors on Social Security and disabled vets were able to get a $250 check at a cost of $14 billion. And we couldn't get one Republican vote for that, while at the same time, Republicans are pushing tax breaks of over $1 million a year for the richest people in this country. Does that seem...
Well, yeah, it tells a story, and I came to the floor right after that vote. I had supported it all along. I co-sponsored Senator Sanders' his effort to bring that to the floor for the $250 check for all seniors and all disabled veterans, I might add, not just Social Security beneficiaries. But I came to the floor right afterwards because I was pretty amazed. I know there's partisanship here. I know that some people think that their whole view of the world is to give tax cuts to the richest people in the country. It'll all trickle down and we'll all do better. It'll all lift all boats. And that's a pretty good economic theory. You might have learned at Harvard, or you might have learned at Johns Hopkins near here or wherever, but it just doesn't work. I mean, it's a nice theory, but it doesn't work to lift all boats. So Senator Sanders' effort was to provide a $250 check one time, cost of $14 billion, but one time, not continued $14 billion, one time for seniors who had not had a cost of living adjustment in 2 years. And it just seemed to make so much sense when the average senior in this country gets about a $14,000 a year Social Security check. I guess that's about $1,200 a month. That's not their entire income for most seniors, but it's a big, big part of it. Many seniors live only on that. Many more seniors live on that, but only another couple, $300-400 a month. So when you see the cost of, there's not inflation maybe for people my age so much in this country, but if you're older and you've got a lot of health care costs, there is inflation because that's healthcare costs seem to go up higher than maybe anything but higher education, and maybe as much as that. So it was important that that $250 be provided, we think, to every senior in the country and every disabled vet. Now, what was so amazing about it was that 42 Republican senators have signed a letter saying they will do nothing in the Senate until the tax cuts for the rich are approved, till they're signed into law. Now, it's almost, I've never seen the United States senators engage in a work stoppage or a strike. I mean, it wasn't really quite a strike. It was probably illegal for us to strike. I don't know, maybe, but it really was a work stoppage. They were saying, we're not doing anything until you give tax cuts to my rich friends. And I might say also to many people in the House and Senate whose income is in that bracket too. I'm not accusing them of that, to be sure, but they were there for their rich friends and their biggest contributors and the wealthiest people in this country, but they weren't there for a senior citizen living on $1,200 a month that could use that extra $250. I've met too many seniors, and I know that the presiding officer, when he travels to Colorado Springs, or he goes to Cimarron, or he goes to Denver, I know that he hears seniors say, I cut my medicine, I cut my pills in half because I need my prescription to run for 2 months rather than one because I can't afford it, or I skip my medicine today because my house is too cold and I don't have enough to eat. I mean, we know seniors make those choices, and we make choices here. And the choice we made is 42 Republicans made it and blocked, because you need 60 votes. You know, we had a majority of voters of senators, an easy majority for Senator Sanders' effort on the 53 votes, efforts to do this, the $250, but you need 60 votes. So 42 Republican senators engaged in their work stoppage, saying we're not doing anything until we get these tax cuts for the rich, said no to seniors. And I just am amazed by that, the callousness. I guess I'm even more amazed when you consider, what's today, the 10th or 11th, when you consider in 2 weeks, it's Christmas Day, and that doesn't seem to bother them. Doesn't seem to bother them on unemployment benefits. 85,000 Ohioans a week and a half ago lost their unemployment benefits. 85,000. Their holiday season's ruined. But I guess all of us will go home, and I want to go home and be with Connie and my kids and on Christmas. My children are grown. We have one grandchild. I want to be with them as much of Christmas as I can. But we have a job to do today, and this week, and next week, and this month, and this year, and that is to extend unemployment benefits to people who have lost them, who are looking for jobs as hard as they can, in the great majority of cases, and extending the tax cuts for the middle class, and doing the right thing. And so far, we haven't done that. And I need to go to the airport, but I want to yield back to Senator Sanders for his work today. I hope next week when we come back on Monday, we're prepared to do whatever it takes to say no deal on this one, and to make this work for the middle class, make it work for Social Security beneficiaries, make it work for unemployed workers.
I want to thank my good friend from Ohio, one of the real fighters for working families here in the Senate, not only for coming down here, but for his years of efforts. But he makes a very important point. You know, we have a job to do, and the job is, I know some people don't believe it, rather radical concept, but our job is to represent working families, the middle class, and not the wealthiest people in this country. I've got 4 kids, 6 grandchildren. I look forward to spending the holidays with them. But you know what? We have a job to do. And if it means staying here through Christmas Eve, through New Year's, that is our job. And let's pass a proposal that works well for ordinary families and not just for the wealthiest people in this country. I wanted to thank Senator Sherrod Brown for coming down. And what I want to say now is when you look at this agreement, we've talked now about the absurdity of, in the middle of a time when we have a $13.7 trillion national debt, giving tax breaks to people who don't need it. Senator Brown and I have talked about the dangers inherent in this payroll tax holiday and what it might mean for the future of Social Security. But I also wanted to make another point, and that is that there are many, many billions of dollars in this proposal going to a variety of business tax cuts. Some of them, in fact, might work. Some of them, in fact, might not work. But what is very, very clear is that if your goal is to create as many jobs as possible for every dollar of investment. This particular approach is not very effective. When we talk about tax breaks for corporations and companies, what we should be aware of is that corporate America today is sitting on close to $2 trillion in cash. They have that cash on hand. And the problem is not that they don't have the money. The problem is that working people don't have the money to buy the products that these guys are producing. And I believe, and not just me, but I think a variety of economists from across the board believe that it makes a lot more sense, if we're serious about creating jobs, to invest in our infrastructure. And I say that for a number of reasons. When you put money into roads and bridges and public transportation, you are creating, for every dollar that you spend, far more jobs than giving a variety of tax breaks. That's just what is an economic fact. Second of all, when you are investing in our infrastructure, not only are you creating jobs short-term, you're leaving the country with a long-term improvement that increases our competitiveness in a very tough global economy. I mentioned a moment ago, and we'll get back to it later, China is investing huge amounts of money into high-speed rail, into their roads, into their bridges, and yet if you drive around certain parts of America, you think we are a third world nation. You got roads with all kinds of potholes, you have bridges which you can't go across, you got rail systems where trains are going slower. There's a study out there, and I'm going to get to it later, where somebody said that decades and decades ago, it took less time to go from various parts of this country to the other on train than it does today, because our rail beds are in such bad shape. So if we're going to make our country competitive, you've got to invest in infrastructure. It creates jobs. It adds long-term value to this country. Unfortunately, in this agreement, there is, to the best of my knowledge, not one nickel going into infrastructure. And it is important that we, in fact, add provisions which do invest in our infrastructure and create jobs. Another point, Mr. President, that should be made when we look at this so-called compromise agreement established by the President and the Republican leadership is that in the agreement there is an extension of unemployment benefits for 13 months. Now, there is zero question in my mind that that is something that absolutely has to be done. Right now, Senator Brown made this point, we have millions of Americans who have, through no fault of their own, lost their jobs. Maybe their plants went to China. Maybe their companies couldn't get the loans they needed to stay in business. Small businesses going under, big businesses shutting down plants. No question that we have got to extend unemployment benefits. But what bothers me is that this provision in this agreement, which is a good provision, suggests that this is a hard-won compromise, that the Republicans really conceded something and they agreed to a 13-month extension of unemployment benefits. But here's the fact. The fact is that for the last 40 years, when unemployment rates have gone above 7.2%, Republicans and Democrats, in a nonpartisan way, have come together to say, of course we're going to extend unemployment benefits. This is America. We're not going to let working families who are suffering hard times because through no fault of their own, they've lost their jobs. We're not going to let them lose their homes or not enable them to feed their families. This is America. We're not going to do that. And Republicans have said that 40 years. Democrats have said that 40 years. Democratic and Republican presidents, leaders here in the House and the Senate have said that. So to say, oh my goodness, the Republicans made a major concession, they're going to allow the extension of unemployment benefits for 13 months, that's not a concession. That has been bipartisan public policy for the last 40 years. Now, Mr. President, I've been expressing to you and to the American people why I think this is not a good agreement, why I think this agreement should be defeated, and why I think we can put together a much better agreement. But I do want to be very clear that there are positive aspects to this agreement which should be maintained in an improved proposal. And let me just mention some of them. This proposal, of course, in addition to extending unemployment benefits for 13 months, extends the middle-class tax cuts. And that is obviously something that we have to do. The reality is that the middle class in this country is collapsing. During the Bush years, we saw a $2,200 decline per year in median family income, and working families are hurting, no question about it. And not to extend that tax cut for 98% of America would be a travesty. So we've got to maintain those tax cuts, and that is a positive thing in that agreement, which obviously any future agreement must maintain. Also in this agreement is the Earned Income Tax Credit for working Americans, a very important provision, and the Child and College Tax Credits are also in this agreement. And these proposals will keep millions of Americans from slipping out of the middle class and into poverty, and they will allow millions of Americans to send their kids to college. So I'm not here to say to the president or the vice president that there aren't any good proposals and parts of this agreement. There are. But we can do much, much better. Now, what the president says, and he makes a valid point, he says, well, okay, show me the votes. Show me the votes. He's good at counting. We've tried a proposal here, Mr. President, as you well know, was it last week, where we only got 53 votes, which said that we're going to extend the tax breaks for the middle class and not the very, very rich. And the president knows, as everybody else knows, that around here, Republicans filibuster everything. You need 60 votes. And he says, show me the votes. Well, this is what I would say. What our job right now is about is reaching out to the American people from one end of this country to the other, from California to Vermont, including a lot of our very conservative states. Because frankly, it is not a conservative approach to substantially increase the national debt by giving tax breaks to billionaires. Mr. President, how many times have you been here on the floor hearing our Republican colleagues give long, long speeches about the danger and the unsustainability of a $13.7 trillion national debt and a $1.4 trillion deficit? You've heard it day after day after day. That's their mantra. Well, if they believe that, why are they voting for a proposal that substantially increases the national debt for the very unproductive reason of giving tax breaks to the richest people in this country who don't need it? And I would hope, and the reason why we have to defeat this proposal and fight for a much better one, is I would hope that people throughout this country, in Vermont and Colorado, in many of our conservative states, that they come forward and they say, wait a second, I do not want to see my kids and grandchildren pay more in taxes because we borrowed money from China to increase the national debt in order to give tax breaks to millionaires and billionaires who have done extraordinarily well in recent years, and by the way, have seen a significant decline in their effective tax rate. Mr. President, I know you have heard people like Warren Buffett, one of the richest guys in America. He's made the point over and over again that his effective, what he really pays in taxes, his effective tax rate is lower than his secretary's. And all over this country, you have examples where very, very rich people were able to stash their money in the Cayman Islands, take advantage of all type of loopholes, are paying rather low effective tax rates, in many cases lower than police officers or firemen or teachers or nurses. So I think that this is, in fact, opposition to this agreement should be tripartisan. You should have conservative Republicans, liberal Democrats. I'm an independent progressive. I can tell you, Mr. President, that in the last 3 days, my office has received probably close to 3,000 phone calls, 98% of them against this agreement, probably higher than 98%, and just a huge number of emails also overwhelmingly against this agreement. I suspect, I don't know this for a fact, that this is the kind of message that the American people are sending us all over America. But I think they've got to continue to do that. They have got to make it clear so that we can win over at least a handful of Republicans and some wavering Democrats and say, wait a second, we are not going to hold hostage extending middle-class tax breaks in order to give tax breaks to billionaires. We're not going to hold hostage extending unemployment for workers who have lost their jobs by giving tax breaks to people who don't need it. And I think, Mr. President, if the American people give voice to what they are feeling, which this is not a good agreement, that we can do a lot better. I think, Mr. President, we can defeat this proposal and we can come back with a much, much better proposal which protects the unemployed, extends unemployment benefits, protects the middle class, extends the Bush tax cuts for 98% of the population, and protects a lot of important programs, making college more affordable, making child care more affordable, and helping us transform our energy system. There's a lot that we can do if we defeat this proposal, and if the American people, we're not going to do it inside the Beltway. That I am absolutely sure of. Republicans are very united, but what we have to do is win at least a handful of them, and some wavering Democrats to say, Mr. President, Republican leadership, you guys have got to involve Congress in this discussion. I was very pleased yesterday that the Democratic caucus said, sorry, we're not bringing that proposal onto the floor. And I applaud Speaker Pelosi and the Democratic caucus for saying that. It took a lot of courage. Congressman from the state of Vermont, Peter Welch, played an important role, and I applaud Congressman Welch. Congressman Peter DeFazio played an important role. Congratulate him. But I congratulate mostly the caucus for saying we can do better. We can do better than we are doing. But let me be very frank. We're not going to do better unless the American people stand up and help us. We're going to need a lot of phone calls, a lot of emails, a lot of messages, so that all of our colleagues in the House and the Senate understand the American people do not want to see their kids having to pay off the debt incurred by giving tax breaks to billionaires.